admitting people?
Yes, I can
Okay.
do that from outside.
That would be awesome.
I'm not going to that's just my personal thing.
Okay, so this is what your group, your attendees will see in the background.
Yeah.
So I'll be managing this part from outside, and then it's automatically recording.
Okay, perfect. Can I shrink this then?
Yes,
Go
and
here.
you want them to see the PowerPoint.
I do.
So go back here. So now that's what they'll see.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, everybody. We are going to get started. We're a couple minutes late. Thank you so much for coming to the USC Climate Change Research Panel. I recognize that it's Friday afternoon. I recognize that Thanksgiving is next week. So I really appreciate you guys coming out. I appreciate those that are online and joining us, so that's really great. Today we have 6 faculty, including myself, coming to give you just a little peek at some of the research, communication, outreach, and mitigation efforts that are happening on campus relative to anthropogenic climate change. We have good, broad participation, so from the School of Ocean and Environment, the Department of Geography, Philosophy, and Department of Biological Sciences. So it's really nice to be able to hear kind of a diverse piece of the climate puzzle happening here at USC all today. I want to remind everyone that the 6 of us are in no way the full body of climate change research and action that's happening on campus. So I invite you to look around, get involved, participate, ask questions, raise your voice. There's a lot happening, not just faculty, but students and administration too. So because time is short, I'm just going to dive in. I'm Erin Meyer-Gutbrod, an assistant professor in the SCOE, and I'm going to attempt so quickly to talk to you about 2 different systems in the ocean that are impacted by climate change. So the first is climate-driven changes in ocean circulation are further endangering the North Atlantic right whale. North Atlantic right whales are endangered. They became critically endangered this summer. They were harvested for oil, for blubber to use for fuel, harvested for centuries, and then they've been protected from harvest since the 1930s. Despite almost a century of protection, and we've got propeller marks in the blubber on the animal at the top. The bottom picture shows a right whale that's tangled up in fishing gear. So this population last decade numbered about 500 in the entire species remaining. And we became accustomed to, in this relatively small population size, seeing 3 or 4 carcasses a year. And most of those were caused by these anthropogenic mortalities, 3 or 4 a year. And then in 2017, there were 17 carcasses found in waters around the US and Canada. And that was really something. We expect right whales to spend most of their time in this area, in the Gulf of Maine, Bay of Fundy, Scotian Shelf, where they feed in the spring, summer, and fall. In fact, if you look at these maps, these polygons, the yellow one here and the green ones here and here, those are areas that are protected by the US and Canada. They slow vessels down, they pull fishing gear out of the water, and they modify fishing gear to reduce risk of entanglement. In 2017, when we saw 17 carcasses, so more than quadruple the typical number we see in a year, none of the carcasses were found in those areas that we manage and protect. In fact, 12 of them were found up here in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, completely where we don't expect right whales to occur at all. The problem was a mismatch between where we're protecting the animal and where in 2017 the animal was occurring. So just this fall, I published a paper saying that the reason right whales abandoned their typical foraging habitat in the Gulf of Maine is actually anthropogenic-driven climate change. So if you've been paying attention to the news, or if you read these kinds of papers, there's been a lot of action right now about the slowdown of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. There was a gorgeous article in the New York Times about it in August, I believe. And so, in fact, if you've seen the movie Day After Tomorrow, I think is what it's called, it's all about the AMOC slowing down, and then New York becomes the tundra, right? Essentially, we're seeing this slowdown, and it's driven by climate change. And what happens is when you slow down the circulation, the Gulf Stream, which is part of that circulation, slows down. When the Gulf Stream slows down, it gets lazy and wide, and it meanders. So what happened is the Gulf Stream meandered up and brought hot water, hot salty water, into the Gulf of Maine through these deep basins and channels. Right whales eat copepods that like cold water. So when the Gulf of Maine flushed with warm water, their prey wasn't there in high abundance anymore. So when there's no food to eat, the right whales left. So this paper shows this difference between two decadal regimes, one from the 2000s and one from the 2010s. In the 2000s, the waters in the Gulf of Maine were cool. There was a lot of right whale food in the water. Reproductive females had enough food to reproduce effectively and quickly. And right whales were using the foraging habitats that we expect them to use. So the policies that we have were, they're not great, but they're doing what we expected and keeping carcasses down to 3 or 4 a year. Then in the 2010s, the AMOC really slows down. There's a regime shift right in 2010, and that warm water introduced into the Gulf of Maine tanks the right whale food. Births plummet because reproductive moms aren't building the blubber they need to successfully maintain a pregnancy and lactate to nurse a calf for a year. And then right whales looking for a better place to eat, they leave the Gulf of Maine, enter this new area, and they're victim to anthropogenic mortality. So the big lesson that I want people to learn from this case study is that we scientists need to be thinking on our feet. We need to anticipate climate change and anticipate responses, especially in the case of managed species. So things that are commercially valuable, species that are threatened, endangered, keystone species. We need to look ahead and predict what's going to happen. We also need to develop a dynamic policy framework. So when things happen that are unexpected, we can shift rapidly and manage slowing down vessels, for example, for the right whale, pulling fishing gear out of the water in places that we didn't expect to. The other story I want to talk to you about is climate-driven deoxygenation and how it causes fish to seek new habitat. You may not know this, but warm water holds less oxygen than cold water. Okay, so as waters get warmer, the oceans are capable of holding less oxygen. Warm water is also more buoyant. So it goes up to the surface, and if a wind comes, winds mix atmospheric oxygen into the ocean. And if that top layer is really warm and buoyant, the wind can't mix as much oxygen into the surface. This is a projection. Oh, this is the difference between ocean oxygen concentrations in the 90s versus the 2090s. And all these areas in red are where we expect oxygen concentration to decline in the ocean. So what I did with a group of people is look at fish in rocky reefs off the coast of California. Here's a map of the US. This box is around Santa Barbara and the Channel. We've got these islands, and we have this steep bathymetric gradient that's filled with rocky reefs. And we surveyed fish along this steep gradient from 95 to 2009. We saw what species were there, in what abundance, and what depths they were using. A lot of these species are commercially valuable. A couple of them are threatened. And at the same time, Cal Coffee has some stations. So that's a widespread oceanographic monitoring program. They have stations here at these red dots. And we could tell by looking at the Cal Coffee data that the oxygen was declining significantly over this 15-year time period, but especially at depth. And we followed these fish. There were 60 species that we were able to see regularly over this 15-year time period along the bathymetric gradient. Out of those 60 species, about a third of them over this 15-year period moved higher in the water column. They moved to areas where the oxygen concentration was greater. A few outliers, 4 in fact, moved deeper. I don't know what's going on with that. But here, this is the first study that has actually shown the movement of fish in the ocean that seems to be in response to anthropogenic-driven ocean deoxygenation. Why does this matter? If they're moving up, they're going to eventually have less habitat to use. In fact, if you look at fish movement climate research, most people expect fish to move down because deeper water is colder. But if fish sometimes have to move up because the deeper water has low enough oxygen, you're squishing the available habitat in the water column. And if you don't expect this to happen, then all of your fisheries models are going to be wrong. So this is really important for fisheries management. And then finally, it's so fast. What can you do? Hopefully, these suggestions that I'm not going to go over are all things that you've heard about at some point, maybe things you'll hear about more today. So there's a lot that we can do to mitigate our own climate impact, and also ways we can work with the community to try and make a widespread difference. But I'm going to advocate for something different, and that is to eat sustainably caught seafood. So I brought today these cards, Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch Cards. These are specific to the Southeast US for this time period. And so you can come up and grab one of these cards, and it will tell you the list of fish that's good to eat and caught sustainably. Don't worry, there's more. And then the fish that you absolutely should not eat because they're not caught sustainably. So get the app, come up and grab a card, and when you're at a restaurant, make a good choice about the seafood that you eat. I also have climate themester stickers. So come get goodies. And I'm happy to take a question while Greg comes and gets set up.
Anything that you think we can do for all of these species? Is there any kind of like seed banks for seeds?
Well, you saw Jurassic Park. So that doesn't work out, right?
Well,
And you know, the zoo program has worked to help rehabilitate species. You can't really do that with a whale, right? So with the right whales, it's almost too easy, right? Because we don't have to just stop eating meat and ride our bike to work, right? Climate change, there's not much you can do when we're talking about saving a species that has 500 animals left, okay? But we're killing them all with ship strikes and fishing gear entanglement, okay? So we're developing ropeless fishing gear so lobstermen, snow crab fishers can continue to catch the same quotas without having gear in the water that's going to tangle up the right whales. We're also trying to put more ears, literally listening for right whales in the water, so that we know when right whales are present and we can advocate for ships to slow down. That's something I'm working on right now, is putting gliders in the water listening for right whales right here off of South Carolina. They'll detect and classify right whales automatically, send me a signal. I can send it to ship captains on my phone, and they'll say, oh, there's a right whale in the water, like right near where I'm planning to boat. I need to go under 10 knots to reduce that risk of ship strike. So there's things we're trying to do, but just got to keep working at it.
A follow-up there will be like, they will go and kind of like.
Yeah, so according to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, it's illegal to approach a right whale. Those vessel captains, you know, even like interested day riders, tourist boats that are going on whale watches, those aren't the boats that are implicated in killing right whales. We have mostly thought it was big commercial vessels, right? And now we're starting to think that fishermen that aren't paying attention could be implicated as well. But I think that the risk of not telling captains that right whales are near is greater than telling them and having people who are interested in seeing right whales come by and check them out. I don't think we have time for any more questions, but my email address, oops, right there, and I'm so happy to take them over email or we can get a coffee. And now it's time for Greg to come from the Department of Geography and tell us some more things about climate change.
Thank you, Erin. Good to be with you. Thanks for putting this together. We appreciate it. So I want to talk a little bit about, I used to do a lot of work on drought, and in 2015, when we had a couple of feet of rain, I decided that heavy precipitation might be equally interesting. So I'm moving at the other end of the hydrologic cycle. This is a picture from 2015, one of many that one could have taken well after the waters have actually receded, but quite an event. And I want to talk about precipitation changes, mostly locally, why we think there ought to be changes in precipitation that accompany global climate change, and a little bit about what signals we've seen here in the Carolinas. So I'm going to start with this. The basic premise is that with increasing temperatures, we ought to see increasing rates of evaporation. We characterize that with the curve you see here, the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, which is basically showing about a 7% increase in moisture holding capacity of the atmosphere per degree Celsius. And so the premise, of course, is that with increasing temperatures, you have greater capacity for water vapor in the atmosphere. A number of modeling studies and empirical studies have investigated this, looking at specifically how have regional, continental scale temperature changes resulted in the kinds of precipitation changes that might happen. So we're talking, first of all, about amount of moisture, but does that translate into an amount of precipitation that is 7%? That's our basic question. And you can see on the right diagram, a little bit of a busy diagram, but we took an average of the southeastern United States, and we looked at temperature changes through a column and looked at the 99% change of precipitation, that is the high-end events. We see that in many cases, it does approximate about a 7%. That's the dashed line that you see there. In many other cases, it is an overestimation to expect that much. And in some intense situations, in terms of hourly precipitation, it can actually exceed that much. So the empirical evidence is all over the place in terms of actually trying to measure that, as is the modeling evidence, as I'll show you in a moment. It's complicated because in some cases, places are moisture limited. That is, how much water can you evaporate if you're in a very dry situation. Precipitation comes from two things. I tell all my introductory students is you need a source of moisture and then you need something to lift it. So instability is about the lifting, and those situations certainly change in the historic record and are likely to change in the future. And then finally, in the Southeast, our big question is what happens to the subtropical high, the Bermuda high that dictates precipitation in this part of the world in a serious way. We can't model that particularly well, as well as we should, and so there's some complications associated with that. So what have we seen? In the Carolinas, the changes we've seen in precipitation are reasonably modest from the early part of the 20th century to present. So when we look at a 110-year record, this is what we're finding for annual precipitation and then each of the seasons. And you can see everything in green is a station that represents an increase in mean precipitation annually and then seasonally. You can see it's a pretty modest signal, right? And part of this is that detecting a trend when you have lots of interannual and interdecadal variability becomes statistically very difficult to do. So it is a function of finding some stations with a mean change, but there's a lot of noise in the data that make finding that signal relatively challenging. We do see some things. I'm going to show you just a couple of examples of what is the most statistically robust results when we look at precipitation. One is that we see in the fall and in the winter, we see an increase in the number of rainfall days. And in fact, when we categorize rain by category, simply looking at light to heavy precipitation, in fact, this increase in days is leading to more light precipitation in these two particular months. Not particularly the party line in terms of what we might expect theoretically out of the changes in the future. This is what others are seeing: warm season increases in precipitation, cool season decreases in precipitation across the southeast. Again, in this case, they're averaging over a relatively large area. And I'm going to come back to that diagram. Here's some other stuff that we did. We're now interested in precipitation intensity. That is, does the intensity of a 1 in 100 year event, right? An event that has a 1% chance in any given year, has that changed through time? And so by looking at 1 day precipitation, using that as the measure for intensity, and looking at 2-year events, what we can expect once every 2 years, for example, these are the stations that show some signal. So about a third of the stations that have a long enough record to investigate this do show some kind of signal of change. So we're talking about, in this case, if you take an example for Charleston, we're talking about something that's on the order of about a 100 centimeter kind of change, right? So about this much precipitation in the course of a day, right? So that's not 100, excuse me, 100 millimeters change. So this is where you see increases in those amounts. If you move to 10 years, the number of stations that show that signal is reduced a little bit more. So less than a third of the stations show a signal of the kind of 1 in 10 year event that we would expect. And when you move to 100 years, you start seeing even less of that signal. So these are each of the 4 stations you see there that show the higher probability or trend in these low frequency but pretty significant events, right? The 1 in 100 years or 1% chance in a given year. They're happening largely because of big tropical storms. And so we can see a trend simply because one of these places has had one really big event in the last 20 or 30 years. So it's a little bit less of a robust signal when we look at the tails of those distributions. So back to this Marty Hurling paper that sort of looked at the warm season increase. One of the questions we might ask is, can we model these increases in trends? So can we create a model that it can replicate the past that we can then trust for the future? And I want to show you a little bit of these results. So the answer is that if we had a coupled model where the ocean and the atmosphere are talking to one another, the truth is that we can't really marry the patterns that we've seen empirically very well. When you prescribe the ocean temperatures, you can do a pretty decent job with it. So you see the example here, both the warm and the cool season increase and decreases. You can see that when you know what the sea surface temperatures are, the models are reasonably good in terms of looking at changes into the future. So there's a lot of room for people who are marine scientists or applied mathematicians. There's a lot of room for work on understanding how we can better couple atmospheric and oceanic circulation in order to understand that. The fact that you have to prescribe the ocean temperatures is not a good thing when in fact your objective is to project into the future. So lots of room for improvement in that score. We've taken lots of output from what are called regional scale models. So now we're moving from general circulation models of the atmosphere, global models, to regional ones. And what you can see in these 2 diagrams are 2 large areas that we've defined both because of their statistical coherence of regions. So region number 9 in the bottom right diagram is showing a broader southeastern region, and then region number 11 is showing a large swath of the northeast and mid-Atlantic. In red, respectively, are intensity of precipitation measured on the y-axis, and then the return period, often, again, what we're referring to as the 10, 25, 50-year events. And you can see in red the value of depth for each of those recurrence intervals. And then you can see the projections for the future. So when we use these regional scale models, we see almost across the board, all combinations of models of GCMs and regional scale models, we see increases in the middle part of the 21st century for precipitation intensity above the observed record. It gets messy. When we look specifically at a couple of places that could be very nearby one another, and then do the comparisons across models, there's enough noise from one model to the next, which suggests that the models are not coherent, right? That they're not measuring the same exact thing. And we can even see differences across a relatively short spatial scale. So again, it sort of points to the room there, that we have to improve in terms of our modeling capability of understanding precipitation intensity in this region and many others across the world. So let me sum up to say there are lots of theoretical reasons for why we ought to expect heavier precipitation. The fundamental one is a moisture holding capacity, essentially, of the atmosphere. The instrumental record, at least here in the Carolinas, is reasonably modest. And as I suggest, it's reasonably modest in finding a trend simply because there's a lot of noise from one year to the next, making that a very statistically challenging problem. And that's what the next slide shows. That interanual variability is essentially driven by ocean temperatures and ocean changes on a year-to-year and interdecadal basis. Finally, as I suggested in a couple of different ways, there is a lot of room for improving our theoretical understanding and then being able to project into the future based on our ability to model these systems robustly. A lot of, just as one example of that, when you think of heavy precipitation, you think of convective thunderstorms, essentially, right? Or tropical cyclones where they're embedded within the tropical storm. Our models are, in many cases, not taking into account those full processes, right, in an explicit way. And that limitation is showing lots of promise in recent years, but for the most part has only begun in terms of understanding that essential process. So I'll quit there and take your questions if we have time. I think the biggest part that we're seeing some improvement already is when you can include physically the convective process of throwing thunderstorms. And the reason they haven't so far is that you need something of high resolution in order to do that, both in temporal and a spatial scale. It's got to be very high resolution. And so the demands, computational demands, are really high as a result of that. So there are ways to do it, but how you embed it into a global model is part of the challenge. No, I think it's actually an example of simply not seeing that intensity in the instrumental record. To get to one of the things where you see, in that last slide where you had the 100-year events, you saw some places that actually decreased. There was a decreasing trend. So when you get to those 100-year events and you only have a 120 years record, you're really constrained statistically in doing it. So if let's say Asheville had a huge backdoor storm that came out of the Gulf and just dumped tons of Gulf of Mexico moisture in Asheville, and that happened in 1920, it's going to have a downward trend because that's so going to skew the probability distribution from those early periods that when you look at the last 50 years and you don't have one, it's going to show a decreasing trend. So part of it is the actual, when it gets to those extremes, the actual timing of individual events matters a lot to the statistical model.
So it may not be a climate signal that we're registering, but
Right.
more of a data.
Right.
availability
Yeah.
signal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm not confident when I see a trend or see a negative trend or don't see a trend, because I just don't think we have the data to accommodate that for those extreme events in the empirical record. And that's why the modeling still becomes essential, because by the time, we're talking about late 21st century impacts, which could be significant because of intense precipitation. We can't wait that long, and we'll only have 150, 175-year record, but the impacts are going to be potentially profound if you believe some of the stuff from the modeling. Thank you. And apologies for having to sneak out. I have another commitment, but thank you for being here.
Thank you. And now we have Dr. Matt Kissner from the Department of Philosophy.
So thank you so much, Erin, for putting this on and for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk about my work. So my name is Matt Kissner. I teach lots of courses in ethics, and those include courses in climate ethics. And boy, climate change raises lots of really pressing, urgent, and challenging ethical issues. So just to give you kind of some of the flavor of it, I'll mention two of them. So the first one is an issue about justice. So climate change causes burdens. It creates harms that are burdensome, changing places burdens on people. And it's an unfortunate consequence of climate change that those burdens tend to fall on the most vulnerable. So the burdens tend to fall on people in the developing world, and they tend to fall on the poor. In this country, they tend to fall on minorities. Now, those particular populations, in a way, are kind of the least blameless. They're the most blameless populations. They kind of did the least to bring about the situation, right? Because poor people in the developing world tend to produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions than the affluent do. So they're kind of being stuck, they've got the short end of the stick, right? And then in addition to that, those people aren't really the ones that are benefiting. I mean, the system that we have benefits some people. It gives us lots of reduced energy. There's lots of industries that thrive around the production of greenhouse gases. So these populations are bearing the brunt, but they're not really at fault, and they're not really getting into the benefits. So this starts to look like an issue of fairness, which of course, for ethicists, this is an issue of justice. It's one example. Here's another one. It's also a justice issue, but it's kind of, it's interestingly related to the first. So the first one is sort of like justice at any particular time. So at any particular time, you have these people over here who are suffering because of the actions of these people over here, and that looks like an injustice. But there's this further sort of temporal justice, right? That's a spatial injustice, but there's this temporal injustice because the actions that we take now are affecting the lives of our children and affecting the lives of their children. So there's this issue of intergenerational justice, which is fascinating. So in a way, we are benefiting right now of these enormous benefits of this fossil fuel system, and there's costs, but the costs aren't being borne by us. We're passing them on to our children and to their children. Okay, so in my courses on climate ethics, we talk about these ethical issues. Now, why is that important? Well, obviously, you want to know about injustices in the world, but also because when we understand these ethical issues, they provide us with some guidance in terms of what we should be doing and how we should be managing our policies. So I'll give you one example of that, which has been important, informative in my thinking about these. One of the things that's interesting about climate ethics is that everybody's hands get dirty. You might think, well, I'm just going to opt out. I'm not going to worry about this. I'm going to tell myself climate change isn't real, or I'm just too busy to do anything or be active about it. And then you might think, oh, well, I'm not doing anything. And so because I'm not doing anything, therefore I am blameless. But the problem is the whole system is set up so that if you're not doing anything, you are actually being an active participant in a system that does nothing. So by doing nothing, you are perpetrating an injustice, and you're an active participant in a system that causes injustice, right? So this is one way that reflecting about justice guides us in terms of policy, because it tells us that the less that we act, the more that we're contributing to a kind of global injustice, and so therefore we ought to be acting more and doing more. So I take that seriously, and because I take that seriously, I applied for this grant, which I won, from the Ann Johnson Institute for Science, Technology, and Society, yay AJI, I love them to death. And the grant focuses on, it supports a class that I've taught, the development of a class that I've taught twice now, and then a conference, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, the grant focuses specifically on how these ethical issues play out in the city of Columbia. So it's about climate change in the city of Columbia. And there's a reason why I think it's important to focus on that. So climate change is like the greatest challenge that the human race has ever faced. Responding to climate change is going to require us to change literally every single aspect of how we live on the planet. How we produce energy, how we get from one place to another, how we work, how we play, everything has to change. If that is true, it's not the case that you can think about climate change as something that's the UN's problem or whatever global governing system you have, it's their problem. You can't say it's the national government's problem. You can't even say it's the state government's problem. It's really everybody's problem all the way down to the municipal level. So I wanted to focus on climate change here in Columbia because that's a way of taking responsibility for thinking about it at all levels. It's also particularly important to focus on the municipal level because that's the front line for climate change. So when we think about things like flooding or extreme heat events, when we have sea level rise that's going to affect Charleston, I mean, you can say that those are the UN's problems, you can say those are the federal government's problems, but we're going to be the ones having to deal with those things. And it's members of our communities. So if we have flooding here in Columbia, who's the most affected by that? People who have to live in floodplains, people who have to live in low-lying regions, which is usually people who don't have enough money to live in the higher up regions, right? If there's an extreme heat event where the temperatures are elevated for extended periods of time, who's affected by that? People who can't afford air conditioning, or people who have air conditioning but they can't afford the exorbitant electrical bills, right? So we're going to be, those are our members of our community that are going to be affected. So I wanted to focus on the municipal level. Another thing that the work allows me to do is to focus on municipal level policy options. And there's a particular reason for this. So the way that the course works is it involves kind of the students becoming researchers and me becoming a researcher as well, doing kind of field research. So every student gets a policy area, they get a pick. So it could be like responding to extreme heat events or responding to flooding or residential solar installations or retrofitting buildings to make them more energy efficient, whatever it is. And their job is to then go out into the city, into the county, and get a sense of what is the lay of the land? What kinds of policies are in effect? What does the city do about these things? What does the county do about them? What does the university, kind of municipal level institutions, what do they do about them? And what could they be doing, right? Which means looking at other cities and what other cities are doing and sharing this information. This is very important work because as we have learned by having these conversations, cities don't know, right? This is uncharted territory. It's not like there's a roadmap for what you're supposed to be doing for all of this. They genuinely don't know. And it's not just Columbia. All cities are learning under extreme conditions. And cities often don't have a ton of resources to do this kind of work. Here in Columbia, we have a larger city. Smaller cities have far fewer resources than we do. And I feel like we don't even have nearly enough resources for all of this. So you have to have, knowledge sharing. What different policies are people trying? What's working? What's effective? So the idea of the conference, Climate Ready Columbia, April 1st and 2nd, here at USC, write it down. I hope you'll all come and help promote it. So the conference is about putting a spotlight on these policy options, figuring out, okay, what should we be doing to prepare for flooding events? What should we be doing to prepare for extreme heat events? What could we be doing to make it easier for people to drive electric vehicles or shift our fleet towards electric vehicles, city buses and things like that? And there's sessions that focus on all of these different policy options, trying to bring together people from other cities who've had success with this, and policymakers here in the city, and the scientific experts who are helping us to work our way through this. So I'm very proud of the coalition of people that we've managed to bring together to participate in the conference. So you'll hear about CPAC, so the city is involved, county government is involved, the university is involved, we have faculty, we have student groups, and then we have a ton of community involvement. I didn't want to have one of those conferences that academics have where they just sit in a room and talk to each other, because that's not going to help us in this issue. That's not going to help us. So we have a lot of different community groups. We have the Sierra Club, Conservation Voters South Carolina, Gills Creek Watershed Association, the State Energy Office. There's a lot of different, I'm going to forget some of them, Climate Realities. There's a ton of these different kind of partner organizations that are all involved in this conversation. So that was what I wanted to talk about. Do you have any questions about anything?
Climate change is very visible. New Orleans, you got hurricanes decimating global. When you look at Colombia, you have a lot of less tangible things people aren't going to see.
Yeah.
How do you go and bring in a wider audience that you can go and you can point at something that everyone knows and everyone sees as this is climate change, this is why?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the flood was important, right? So the 2015, right? It was 15, 2015 flood. So that's a very visible sign that, I mean, they just started building something down on Garner's Ferry by Gills Creek, where there was like the tidal max, the decomposing tidal max for all that time.
The car wash.
Yes, and now they're putting something in it, which causes me some concern. So that's one example that really I think is visible, and I think the heat events. I mean, it's going to happen, and everybody's very aware of how hot Colombia is, and how much that affects us in the summer. So I do think we have those kind of visible effects. I think people can see the weather is different. It feels different. Yes?
So, in Colombia, how is it? How can you actually
So the question is, what do I want to see the city do? Okay, well, firstly, I'm going to defer to Lori, because she's the expert on that, and she's coming up. I think the main issue, which I'll probably talk about, so I'll be really brief and let her be the star of the show for that. But the main issue is the way that the climate response is built into the structure of city government. So there needs to be an Office of Sustainability where there are staff dedicated to just this, and they need to answer directly to the city manager. So I think that's critically important. And then once you've got like a structure for actually thinking about these things, then there's a lot more that you can do when you have the staff time.
Thank you to Dr. Matt Kissner. Now we have Dr. Dean Hardy. Yep.
All right, hello everyone. So as the slide said earlier, I'm an assistant professor jointly appointed in geography and SEOE. SEOE is my home, environmental sciences. So I want to talk to you guys about climate justice today. And so it's a nice segue, I think, that we're going to come back around to Columbia. I'm going to move us down to the Georgia coast. I want to talk to you all about the intersections of water, land, and soil. and specifically how achieving climate justice through research requires thinking through the messy and entangled relations of floods, property, and economic development as they relate to water, land, and soil. Now, floods are not so difficult to understand, I hope, or you just can imagine water coming into a place we don't want it to be. Property is perhaps a little bit more difficult, but land ownership is what I'm going to talk about specifically as it relates to property. And economic development is even a bit trickier and more complicated. So by economic development, I'm going to think through the collaborative work that I'm doing with saltwater Geechee residents on the coast of Georgia on Sapelo Island specifically. So in our collaboration, we're striving to achieve what we're calling agricultural revival to generate revenue for the community and job creation in the community on Sapelo Island. And so this picture here on the screen is from our harvest in 2020, so a year ago, November 2020, on Sapelo of purple ribbon sugarcane. This year's harvest, 2021, was actually just a couple of weeks ago, in which we endured rain, 40-degree temperatures, and the most severe astronomical flooding that Sapelo has ever seen. So astronomical is non-storm driven flooding. In fact, 3 of the 5 highest tides recorded in 20 years of record on Sapelo occurred 2 weeks ago. So flooding is becoming an issue. Last year's cane harvest, in particular, the one that this photo is from, was extra special because after 5 years of growing, harvesting, and replanting cane, so the way cane is produced is you can reuse it as seed cane to expand your product. You get about a 1-to-5 ratio. For every 100 feet, you can plant 500 feet if you reuse it. We were able to actually use last year's harvest though because we had enough of what we wanted that we could take some off and make cane syrup. So who do I mean when I say we though, right? Who is doing this harvesting? First and foremost, I mean Maurice Bailey, who's pictured here in his golf cart, but also you can see him tilling and hoeing to the right here. Now the person in front of him, the youngster here, the toddler, is his 2-year-old nephew, 2 years old at the time, Aiden, who's now about 6. Right? And so a lot of the work that he and his brother Stanley in the back with seed cane are doing are for people like Aiden. Right? This is what they're envisioning. This is the reason they put in volunteer labor. Maurice is the founder and CEO of Save Our Legacy Ourselves for Solo, an idea that his mother, Miss Bailey, generated, Cornelia Walker Bailey, who I'll talk about in a minute. He's also the ag director for the Sapelo Island Cultural and Revitalization Society, known as USC-CAS. Basically, these are 2 nonprofits run by saltwater Geechee folks on Sapelo Island. And their goal here, both of these nonprofits actually, as I've stated here, is to preserve the culture, heritage, and traditions of saltwater Geechee people on Sapelo. All right, so you're like, what is Sapelo? Maybe some of you know, maybe some of you don't, right? Sapelo is a barrier island, it's a sea island in the center of Georgia. It's part of a string of sea islands that basically runs from northern Florida into North Carolina. The saltwater Geechee of Sapelo specifically are part of a broader African-American cultural group called the Gullah Geechee, who live along the coast and sea islands of the southeastern U.S. But today on Sapelo, there are fewer than 50 full-time residents. In this remaining community here of Hog-Hammock, there used to be many communities in the past and a lot more people. As many as 500 to 1,000 people lived there in the past. And that's a history that I don't have time to share with you. Most of the island is currently managed by the DNR as either a research reserve back here in the back or a wildlife management reserve. Currently, the University of Georgia also has a marine institute, very similar to our own Baruch Institute that USC has on the coast here near Georgetown. UGAMI, as it's known, has been hosting marsh research here since the late 1940s, officially as UGAMI since 1953. But despite the 74 years of academic research that have been ongoing here, some of it international in acclaim, barely any research is focused on the local community, and certainly not in collaboration with the local community. So what is it that I'm doing here on Sapelo? And what is it that I'm trying to share with you? There's a 3-part strategy that we're working on. That focuses on the key topics I mentioned earlier of water, land, and soil. And our methodology could be described as participatory action research. This might be something that you've all heard of before, but it's what Nick and I call, and Nick Heinen is the UGA professor that I'm working with on this project, abolition ecology. And abolition ecology specifically draws on the ideas and principles from the field of political ecology, but also abolition democracy and abolitionist ideals, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, think back to civil rights era, but all the way back to right the Civil War, right? Abolishing injustices, basically. Where our goal is to supplement existing labor and resources by working together to increase self-determination for Saplow's Black population. As noted geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore has put it, in order to make something, right? Our goal here is to make something on Saplow. I came to Saplow in 2015 asking research questions about flood memories, histories, and concerns of sea level rise, right? I was like, what's the vulnerability of folks to sea level rise? What's y'all's vulnerability? What's your flooding experience? I was quickly shut down by the island matriarch at the time, Cornelia Walker Bailey, Maurice's mom. She told me that flooding wasn't a problem, and concerns of future flooding were absurd to think about given the ongoing needs of strategizing for land retention, and in turn, the need to create jobs on the island so folks wouldn't so folks would want to stay, or better, even still return to the island, right? Less than 50 full-time residents, population, job opportunities. No one cares about saving the land if there are no job opportunities on the island. So Ms. is responsible for how my research came to be about intersections of water, land, and soil, as she saw salvation in agricultural revival. So given these intersections, Nick and I at UGA have strategized with Maurice and decided to focus on the island's extensive drainage ditch network, which you can see mapped here over 3 different time periods. Our central research question is this: are the ditches dug by the enslaved ancestors of current residents to drain freshwater off the island for the purposes of plantation agriculture currently serving as conduits for saltwater intrusion and increased flooding of properties, homes, and the current agricultural project and agricultural revival efforts? I heard Miss Bailey's point about flooding. Believe me, I responded to it. But I also see it as an increasing issue of concern, because not 2 months after she told me that, in 2015, Saplow experienced nuisance flooding for the first time in a decade. And you see this gap here. 2015 is that first red triangle to the right of the word nuisance. And subsequently, it has flooded around this time of year, right? This is when king tides happen in the southeast. For 5 of the past 7 years, 3 of the highest being this year, right? That I didn't show you and that are not on this graph. So now all flood related research I do is geared toward mitigating flood risk in the community, not merely collecting narrative histories of flooding. So to better understand flood risk, we can do things like capture events like this. This is Hurricane Irma in 2017, right? The most significant flooding event on record, right? There's only 20 years of record here. Much more significant events have happened historically. But to better understand flood risk in the community means having better data about what's ongoing, taking the time and the effort to put in research into this community to look more specifically at what the flood regime is and at what the tidal regime is. So to that end, some of the work that I've done is install 10 water level loggers in the tidal creeks and drainage ditches around the community specifically. We have about 3 years of data now, which we hope will help us better understand flood risk and better forecast possible effects under rising seas. But more direct and meaningful, recently, just this month, just last week on the 15th, actually, I guess just on Monday, a partnership between the state and USC-CAS, one of the nonprofits I mentioned, hired a Georgia Sea Grant fellow to use some of the actual data that I'm doing, that I'm collecting, and myself as a mentor to identify funding sources, but also the more vulnerable island infrastructure and homes using our water level data, right? To turn some of the data that we're collecting, looking at the histories of drainage ditches and how they may be impacting flood risk into usable community data that can be used to seek funding for elevating homes, for example, or mitigating pathways of flooding coming into the community. So circling back around to the point made earlier that mitigating flood risk is a moot point for a lot of Black folks on the island if no saltwater Geechee own the land when the seas have risen enough for it to be a persistent problem, right? Rather than one that's just an annual inconvenience at the moment. Much of my current research is turned to archival research on property ownership, looking at property ownership histories and histories of land loss, specifically thinking through how to better understand land and property transactions in order to secure funding for a community land trust to be run by USC-CAS, the nonprofit I was mentioning, in order to help them in developing land retention strategies or land future strategies. This work still has a long way to go, but more than that even, it means collaborating on incredibly sensitive subjects for folks who live on the island and own property there. either outright or with numerous family members. The latter form of which, makes ownership very vulnerable, and it's called heirs property, and I don't want to talk about it. But the sensitivity of this is such that one of my closest collaborators and I wrote a 1,000-word article. I wrote the 1,000-word article a couple of weeks ago for publication in the newspaper to raise awareness, and was told not to publish it by him because he's afraid of the kind of triggering property transactions it could have by educating people on what they could actually do to dispossess people of land. Right, so there's this kind of effort that you put into this kind of community work that doesn't always lead to fruitful products. It led to something about our relationship that was fruitful, but it means sometimes sacrificing your own energy and labor. That's my point. So you can see here in this slide, these two images. One is of flood risk in the community of Hog Hammock. And the one on the right kind of begins to capture what I'm calling gentrification in Hog Hammock. And outsiders and non-traditional property owners are coded orange in the map. And the ones that are outlined in yellow are LLCs or companies, right? Which to me signals investment properties. Just in the 6 years that I've been working here, it's clearly transition. There's a demographic shift that's ongoing in the community. Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time articulating what the Heritage Authority is, the gray land, but in short form, it's state-owned land. One of the ag program's goals is to occupy and use as much of that land as possible to build back and build up Black presence in the community with the goal of dissuading outsider investment. You can see here too, the green leaves, the plots are where our ag plots are, and the blue icons are where the water level waters are in the community. So I think this is a good point for me to talk about my own positionality in all this. Doing this kind of community engaged research means getting entangled in the politics of decisions, and as a white male academic, coming here to SAPLA to do research brings its own baggage and problems as well. The abolition ecology approach I take is focused on mitigating immediate problems of flood, increasing flood risk, but also working with the state to dismantle the systemic racism that upholds and reinforces Black land dispossession in this place. My being here, though, will unavoidably reproduce white privilege in particular ways. It's just inescapable. My hope, however, is that by collaborating with Maurice, pictured here in the New York Times last year, and several other key community members, is that the energy and labor that I bring to this space contributes more to dismantling those systems than it does to upholding them. At the moment, the majority of labor for the Ag Project is volunteer-based and so requires enormous amounts of organizing. Much of that work has been done by Nick and Maurice, but I keep showing up and helping where I can, how I can, if in no other way other than through a commitment to seeing this project through to success. Now, for me, this is what climate justice research is, the embodiment of ideals enacted in and through everyday life and labor with communities like Hog Hammock and with people like Maurice, who are on the front lines of climate change, but whose generations of resistance to dispossession and displacement I can only hope to aid through transforming the systems and institutions that have upheld those dispossessions and displacements, striving towards what I said earlier about geographer Wilson Gilmore, is to make something. This is a picture of us from this year's harvest, and this is all the cane we harvested. Last year, we were able to produce 100 bottles of syrup. This year, I just got word a few hours ago, actually, they made 180 bottles of syrup this past week. The bottles go for $100 each. This is a photo of them making the syrup. So thanks a lot. Are there any questions?
Hi, so I'm Lori Z, and I'm going to talk a little bit along the lines of what Matt was speaking about city things. And I need to just start by saying I am a reformed isotope biogeochemist, full stop. I used to study permafrost, look at glaciers, and all things like that. But I'm going to show you through the beginning of this that I had to go through a bit of a transition because I was finding the lack of climate action depressing. And I needed to do something. And I needed to do something to kind of ease my grief, if you ever hear about eco-anxiety or things like that. And it's, for me, it's been transitioning into doing some action and what I've been learning at the local level and what can happen at the city government level, because I found a huge void there. So that's just sort of how I got to be where I am. I am not trained in any of this. I'm fully self-taught, which also means that all of you can go do it if you're so dedicated to go do that sort of thing. So, city level climate action. And really all of this starts for me in November of 16. We all know what happened in November of 16, but I also got, don't worry, you get a picture. But in terms of, in November of 16, I won an award to go to Antarctica. I got to go on an amazing experience for 2 field seasons at this crazy Antarctic station. It was built by someone who was not part of a traditional government structure in terms of what most Antarctic stations are. And it was completely run by solar and wind, except for when they were welding. But essentially, if they weren't welding, we had everything done without having to turn on any generators. And this was an amazing creative experience to think about. You can do this even in an extreme environment. Then fast forward to the summer of 2017, and it was becoming clear that the second largest emitter in the world was not going to uphold its place in the Paris Agreement. And so what was going to happen after that? And so that at that point, many mayors stepped up and said, okay, fine, we'll do it. And so there was lots of grand political aspirant promises about what was going to happen. And to that end, Mayor Benjamin was one of those. And he pledged that the city would become 100% renewable by 2036. He was not alone, and that essentially that there was hundreds of mayors across the country that made this pledge. I am not entirely sure any of them knew what they were getting themselves into, because none of them, I think, really realized that we all live in very different energy markets, energy structures, and we don't always have the choices for how we power ourselves. So I'm still in a bit of grief at this point, trying to figure out what to do, a bit despondent. We take a couple years, and then we get to May of 2019. I end up joining the city's Climate Protection Action Committee. I'm like, holy crap, there's a committee about this? And so this is, the city has this volunteer group that advises the city on what needs to happen. At this time, this committee is deeply embedded in the org chart. So as Matt was saying that I may speak to, I have become one that thinks about org charts now. Where are you having your action? Are you putting it deep somewhere in an org chart where they have no voice? But we are basically in a department, we report to a department that focuses on day-to-day operations, and are you meeting your budget? Not, are you thinking long-term? Are you thinking proactively, et cetera? So that kind of puts whatever the committee says at a bit of a tension point to the staff. We've since worked on that where we're getting higher in the org chart in terms of having a city manager we report to, but I'll tell you a little bit how we got there. So May 2019, I joined the committee. Most of 2019 to the early part of 2020, we sit around a table at our meetings and just like share tiny stories. We don't really have any grand action points. There was no grand leadership on what we were doing. It was just sort of like, we're on this committee, we're doing good things, but were we really actually doing anything? And so then the pandemic hit. And it was at this point that I actually met Matt. And Matt was like, hey, Lori, what are you doing at that committee? What are you doing? Kindly, right? And I kindly said, I have no idea. We're not really doing anything. So to that end, because we had to stop meeting, at first when the pandemic happened, then Matt asking questions, and there were a few other people asking questions, that made me, and I had been made chair of the committee at that point, because I was kept on throwing ideas at things, and so they made me chair. So I was like, okay, let's do something then. And so then I started stirring the pot, essentially, and I started making trouble. I haven't always been, it hasn't always been a smooth ride, but I think we're making progress. And I think that the pandemic was a blessing in disguise for this committee. So sometimes think about the disruption, and the disruption actually can lead to some really great things. So was progress actually being made on this goal? Was something that we had never really evaluated on the committee. Yes, the mayor had made this statement, but like, how are we actually getting there? Was anyone actually doing any work on it? And the answer was no. So we started to try, really. And so we started to try, how can we go do that? So I want to give you some ideas in terms of where we're going and what we're doing. It is slow, but it's progress. So you've heard things today that are a lot about adapting to climate change. I'm not trying to get us to work on the adaptation point right now. I'm like, let's stop this. Let's slow this down. Like, there's one thing to adapt, but it's like, how do we reduce the suffering by decreasing the emissions? So that's a lot of what we've been doing. And so first thing you have to think about with reducing emissions is, do you need to consume all the electricity you do? Because right now we are emitting carbon in how we are using our electricity. So can we do better? So in terms of reducing energy usage, does everyone know about how you can actually get assistance to improve your energy use? Probably not. So some members of our committee have been doing outreach on that aspect, and especially for low to moderate income people, trying to show them where there's resources to be able to go improve the quality of their dwellings, to be able to have lower energy bills. And then there's the concept also about energy labeling. So half of the dwellings in the city of Columbia are rentals. And not all of those people have lots of money. And I don't know if you know, but our price of electricity is really high here. And there's very low building codes. So that means a renter usually has exorbitant power bills because that's what they're using for heating and cooling. But you don't know when you sign a rental agreement whether or not you're like what your power bills really are. So one thing that we were trying to investigate in collaboration with the State Energy Office was, is there a way that you can have energy labeling? So before you actually sign a rental agreement, can you have those power bills disclosed? We ran into lots of legal troubles, but we're not giving up because this has been done in some other places. And so we're trying to figure out if there's ways to do that. Also, we're trying to see if we can do that for real estate in terms of, can you have that energy disclosure before a sale happens? Because that will, in the end, incentivize doing better. Not all landlords love us for this pushing on the rental aspect, and there were certain members of council who may have been landlords, never mind our governor, but like in terms of, but in terms of the landlords don't like this because they see this as a cost. So what this ends up meaning is we need a way to be able to finance it. So the State Energy Office is actually working on a green bank, which will in the future be able to help finance some of that because it has a shorter term return, et cetera. So like there's lots of pieces of the puzzle that need to come together to make some of these happen, is what I want to communicate. So this is reducing energy usage, but that's not what the mayor's goal was. The mayor's goal was he wanted to be 100% renewable. So we also need to change how we generate electricity. I don't know if you've ever gone down the energy wormhole of South Carolina law. You don't really have a choice about anything, and we have an investor-owned utility. For most, if you're Dominion, they are beholden to the shareholders, not to you as the utility user. And you don't have choices about how you can go build things with new electricity in the state because of how it's built. So we have to figure out ways to work with Dominion or push their buttons to make it clear that they need to do better. The people who govern what Dominion does is the Public Service Commission. This is a group of people who are appointed by the State House who basically, they used to rubber stamp, but now they actually look at it. The long-term plan for Dominion, what's happening, if there needs to be rule changes about power, et cetera. And you can go to the Public Service Commission hearings and you can pay attention. You can participate in this. You don't have to be a silent partner in all of this. There's ways that you can do things. Anyways, Public Service Commission recently got replaced, mostly. And this is making it so they are now challenging Dominion in what they're doing. Historically, they hadn't, they rubber stamped everything, but they're doing better now. So Dominion has a long-term plan to be carbon neutral by sometime late in the century, essentially, which is not helpful when we have goals that's in 2030. So there's ways that we're actually working with Dominion to do better, and I'll tell you about that in a second. We also hired an energy consultant to be able to advise on this Ready for 100. He came up with some great strategies, but didn't necessarily help us with the stepwise of what we need to do. So we still need to figure out, like, how are we going to have 5-year goals, 10-year goals, and how are we going to achieve all that? We don't know yet. You notice I'm saying we. Most of this right now is being done by the volunteer committee in terms of these efforts that I'm talking about. Also, just to put it on here, the adaptation part, this is not currently being worked on for the city, but it's things that I hope that we will be able to do. Actually, Kristen Dow is starting to do some heat vulnerability mapping and trying to figure out how that will help with tree planting. We don't have a heat plan. We house vulnerable citizens in the winter, but we have nothing for the summer. And so there's things that we should be doing for that. You will also notice that I have nothing about flooding on here. We have a green bond, one of the first green bonds for flooding ever is in the city. However, it's all been planned for and prepared by engineers. So it's already being done in a way that we don't need to really take care of it because there's already staff working on some of that. And there's lots of other areas for improvement. Lots. So what about this? Can we work on sourcing renewables? So as chair of the committee that I'm on, I occasionally get to present to council and say, here are the great things we're working on. Sometimes they listen to me. But in April, I presented to them something about a free year-long working group from World Resources Institute about renewable cohort aggregates, or all those words stick together, but basically get a bunch of organizations, come together and build some solar, even if you're in a market that might not work for it. And they bought it, like where council was like, okay, we'll listen to you, it's free, so we've got nothing to lose. So essentially, right now, we have at the table the City of Columbia, Richland 1, University of South Carolina, Richland County, thank you, Matt, and Columbia Housing, that these 5 organizations are currently meeting probably twice a month at this moment, in terms of, and I'm helping pull this whole project together, where the goal is to build between 100 to 150 megawatts of solar at some place in Richland County. And so that can provide some percentage of power. It's going to be low in terms of like 10 to 15% of each of these organizations. So this is like baby steps. But it's baby steps, but good steps, because it's pulling organizations to work together that don't normally work together. And that's going to help for other procurement things in the future. And so hopefully that will help make things better. And so just so you see, in terms of like, I know it's too much text, but it shows you dates from April of 2021 through June, essentially, of 2022, of all these different workshops that WRI is hosting and leading us through, where they tell us things about having, I don't know, request for information, or how to do RFPs, or what's your accounting structure, or what legal concerns do you need to have. Like, I've learned so much through this, and this way around, it's kind of making my head hurt, but it's really wonderful because we are all in this little cohort, all learning together, and we're all learning to ask all the hard questions together. And recently, we had a conversation with Dominion about this, where we said, hey, we're working on this. We want to be able to build this large solar. There's no legal structure that we can do it without Dominion at the moment. So this is why we had to have that conversation. Dominion was like, great, we'll support this. They hold all the cards for what the rate is, though. So we don't know yet if they actually will be rate neutral or not. Economics makes, if you talk to a large solar developer, it should be rate neutral, if not cheaper. But because Dominion holds all the cards, we have to wait and see what happens. A really wonderful thing that happened recently throughout all of this, though, is I asked council if we could add community solar to this. Because right now, if you rent, or if you own a house that you can't put solar on, you have no options for how to get solar. And before SC&G was taken over by Dominion, there was a community solar program. It was very small, and it got overprescribed very quickly. And when I asked council, can we add community solar to this, because Dominion had already said we could add community solar to this, council said, yeah, that's a great idea. So the hope is, as we do this, we will be able to add a certain component to this that's community solar to have, so renters and other people can actually get solar, even though they can't put it on their house. So this is sort of the timeline of what we're doing, and the goal is 100 to 150 megawatts, and recently both the city and Dominion okayed adding community solar to this deal. We have no idea how the hell we're going to administer this. We don't know the details. As we often say, the devil's in the details for a lot of what we're doing, but we're making progress, having people saying, yes, we'll get there, and we can do this, and that's an open door, and I will exploit those opportunities if someone says yes. So where could this all go? So using the same framework of reducing carbon emissions and then also heat, this is where I think things could go. But lessons I've learned through all of this is, I don't know if you've ever looked at a map or paid taxes or tried to figure out how anything works here, but we are a city in a county that has many different local governments all together. It is not simple. If you want to look at how the transit is operating, that is not the city, that is not the county, that's a local conglomerate. So there's lots of organizational barriers that need to be overcome to make things happen. If you've also paid attention to the people who are working on bike lanes, 70% of the roads, 70% are state-owned in terms of the city. And so that also means it's really hard for the city to do anything about bike lanes because you also have to coordinate with the state because it's complicated. So working amongst organizations is going to be fundamental to all of this. And I don't think anyone realized this as we're having these aspirational goals. And so a lot of work needs to be done to do that. So science is only part of the solution, really. And I need us to remember that as we get thinking about things, because other important factors are organizational management. Are there staff that can work on this? Are you in the right part of the org chart? Are you having resources put towards this? These are simple questions that you would think are very obvious, but they're not always there. And sometimes, you may know this from being at a university, turning the ship is very hard and slow, but you can do it. It just takes a lot of pressure to do it. Is there available monies? I know that people never like to hear about their taxes going up, but is there magically money to go work on new projects if you also have broken water mains? And so it's about helping the city figure out where the funding sources are. There's lots of opportunities that are going to be coming down the pipe very soon, but they don't always know about them. So half the battle right now is helping identify opportunities so we can go perhaps do it. And I say local laws, but really this is at state level too. Just because the federal government also might say something magical is going to happen as it relates to the climate, that doesn't always mean it's easily applicable at the state level. And so we have to do a lot of work on trying to understand how we can change things to make it better. I just want to say one final thing because it relates to the Gullah Geechee Nation. And I was at a DOE workshop earlier this week where the DOE really wanted to bring technical assistance to the communities to be able to figure out your energy goals. And it was really clear hearing Queen Quet talk about how she was just like, you can't just throw your technological solutions at everything because you have to come and listen. And between what she was saying and pushing on the DOE people at that day, it made me realize that if we always have the system the way it is, with investor-owned utilities basically driving the bus, we will never fix the system because there will always be inequities in it. So just think about that as how we need to change things to make climate change better. So that's all I have. Yeah.
So scientific background, how did climate change, especially
Teaching in Booker T. Washington. So in all seriousness, so I teach large non-major classes, and I learned over the time of how to communicate with broader audiences by figuring out how to speak to non-specialists. And then I would do community talks, and then I would do some other things. But it was really just trying and opening my mouth in front of other people and trying to assess whether or not what I was saying was making it. Yeah.
What about what our keynote speaker said last week about how renewables might not fit? You know what I mean? It might not quite make it.
So there's some people, so like Saul Griffith, who's electrifying, rewiring America. So he's like, you can totally do it. It's totally possible. We can totally get to electric. But then also having to teach marine science, you're like, whoa, 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 where are those rare earth minerals coming from? And the ethics of how that's working. And so I don't know what is the best solution, but we need to just start and work on it. At least we do have a head start a little bit here in the South. As much as people look at it and think it's bad, nuclear is helping us on the carbon front. And half the power that we have right now, well, before this week, but half the power that we have here right now is generated by nuclear. And so that helps us so that we don't have to raise the bar as high. And the ideal isn't really known in terms of, because where's the suffering? In terms of, it might work for us to move everything to 100% solar or wind, but where are those rare earth minerals coming from and who's suffering to get them to us? There's no great answer.
Is this working or? All right. Here we go. There I am. I'm Nate Center. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but hopefully try to buoy our spirits and think about the fact that not everything is necessarily going down the tubes for all species. Let's leave it at that. That's our rosy take-home message right there. And I'm going to start that process off by looking at this graph, which is one of my favorite graphs. So it's the percentage of species who have experienced local extinctions as a result of climate change. And we're going to avoid right now this freshwater line where 75% of all species have experienced local extinctions. And there's no glass half full with that. I'm going to go over here and say that we've got the 42% of terrestrial species that have experienced local extinctions. And then invert that and say that means, right, 58% have not. That's actually a little better than I thought it was going to be. So who is it among those terrestrial species, and what defines why they're capable of withstanding the onslaught of climate change? Are they all just our friends, the palmetto bugs? Well, if we look at birds, which is what I largely study, the answer is no. Some of them are the equivalent of palmetto bugs, like the house sparrow. Over the past 45 years, their population has grown almost exponentially in North America in the face of climate change. But then there are also species like this little guy, Wilson's warbler, who has also seemingly inexplicably thrived over this past 4 or 5 decades. So what is it about this kind of species, and not necessarily the cockroaches of the world, that is setting them apart? And I'd say that there are 3 keys to climate resiliency if you're a species. The first is predictable cues. I'm going to talk about what this means in a minute. First key is predictable cues. Second key, high quality habitat. And the third key is flexibility. All right, so what do those mean? Well, to talk to you about what they mean, I want to introduce you first to what I think of as the coolest bird ever, the Hudsonian Godwit. You can follow its really incredible migration here with this heat map that relies on citizen science data to show you how they move up through the hemispheres from down here in Chiloé Island and Tierra del Fuego up to breeding grounds in Alaska and on Hudson Bay in Canada. And for the past, oh gosh, what is it now? 14 years, longer than I want to think. I've been working at 2 sites that for some reason are not placed quite right. Beluga's actually there, and Churchill, Manitoba, to try to understand exactly how breeding populations of this bird have been responding to climate change. All right, so we've got Godwits. What do predictable cues mean? What am I talking about? Well, if we think about how we respond to any change, our capability to respond to that change is in large part predicated on our ability to predict, in fact, what the change is going to be. And for that, we need a cue that actually tells us what is going to happen in the future. And that's exactly how migratory birds work too. They start their migrations, say, like Godwits, from South America, well before it's actually time for them to be where they need to go, up in the Arctic in this case. And the reason that they're able to do that is there has traditionally been something that about their environment that says, you know what, it's time to move, because in about a month, you're going to want to be in the Arctic and you're going to want to have eggs, and those eggs are going to want to hatch. So climate change poses an issue though, and that is disrupted many of these predictable cues because, as you might know, climate change is not sort of progressing in this nicely rational linear method. Instead, it's moving along rather asynchronously. So this is a map that I created showing you what the sort of climate change regime is across North America. And the really light colors, like right here, are areas where every single month of the year is warming. And these dark colors, the darker the color, the more months of the year are actually cooling than warming. And at some level, that's a great thing, that not every place is really warming incredibly fast. But if you're thinking about predictable cues, presents a problem, because it means that from month to month, you may not actually know what's going to take place next. And so for a migratory bird that's trying to time its migration northwards and know when to lay its eggs, the lack of predictable cues imposed by asynchronous warming regimes is really problematic. So if we come back to those two Godwit populations that I've been telling you that I work with, one of them is experiencing predictable cues, where throughout the year and all of the places that it occupies during its annual cycle, warming is happening at about the same rate. And so they're able to then continue to time their migrations properly. And here's what it looks like on their breeding grounds, where they want to have their chicks in this period right here. This blue sort of area is the 28-day period of the year when insects are most abundant, and that's what their chicks feed on. And then we look over here, these red lines, and that's when their young are actually hatching from their eggs. So we see that they're hatching right before that peak period, which means that when their chicks are the oldest, need the most amount of food, they're actually getting it. Now, population on Hudson Bay is unfortunately encountering some of those asynchronous regimes, and we see the opposite thing happening, where in most years, the majority of the nests are actually hatching right during the middle of that peak period. And that means when their chicks are oldest, need the most food, they're here on the downhill side of that peak period, and so they're actually starving. All right, so those populations that have good cues, that's a first key to not getting screwed over by climate change too badly. The second is high quality habitat. Now, anybody who's taken any sort of biological class probably here at USC knows that high quality habitat is not as easy to come by as you might hope, but some of it exists. And when it does exist, it allows flexibility to happen. So I'll talk about flexibility yet in a minute, but this is the annual cycle of those Godwits that breed in Alaska. So they start up there in Beluga, Alaska. Then they migrate down through Saskatchewan, in the Amazon basin, Buenos Aires, down to Chiloé Island in Chile, which is a really cool place. And really, as I'll show you in a minute, the linchpin of this entire sort of process. Then from there, they fly back up to the mid-continental US. You might notice this number right here. It's 11,000 kilometers. That's how far an individual can actually fly without stopping. They do it in about 7 days. And that's the second farthest nonstop flight that's ever been recorded. And then from the mid-continent, they move back up to Beluga, Alaska. So for them, as I said, Chiloé down here is really the linchpin. That's where Chiloé is on the map again. And what's so great about Chiloé, for these birds at least, is that it has about 25 intertidal estuaries. And by and large, those intertidal estuaries have been left alone. So there are local scale agricultural processes where they harvest algae to put into your ice cream and your shampoo and things like that. But it happens, generally speaking, at this rather sort of artisanal level. And and it's maintained really great habitat for lots and lots of Godwits. So what that good habitat enables is this third key, which is flexibility. What do I mean by flexibility? Well, flexibility is the ability to respond to change as you experience it. And so let's take a Godwit that happens to have, say, a rough breeding season. Maybe its nest got eaten by a fox, so then it had to re-nest, and it sort of took longer during this process than it might have wanted. And so it might leave Beluga 5 days late. And generally, we think that leaving someplace late means you're going to get someplace else late, and that can have negative repercussions. And if we sort of track this bird, we see that on average, a bird that leaves Beluga 5 days later than it should have, then leaves Saskatchewan 7 days later than it should have, leaves the Amazon 12 days later than it should have, and it leaves Buenos Aires and arrives in Chiloé full 2 weeks later than it should have. But that magical high quality habitat in Chiloé turns things around. And so this bird on average then will head northward only 1 day late, which really isn't late when it comes down to it. That's pretty much on time. And it can keep that up and make it back to Beluga on time. And as I showed you before, reproduce on time, have its chicks then make use of the full set of resources that they would like. All right, so there's 3 keys to a species not getting screwed over by climate change. What does that mean for the way forward? Well, first of all, I think research, which is not, it is happening, but we should be focusing on identifying species that are actually running into these asynchronous regimes that lack the predictable cues so that they can know sort of what climate change is going to look like for them in a given year. Then we also need to sort of think about individual organisms and identify where and when they are most flexible. Because then we can actually target and focus on things like habitat protection, rehabilitation, and even creation of new habitats. And that those habitats can then be used by those flexible species. Because there are parts of the year where they can't actually respond to change or potentially new habitats. And so putting our efforts there isn't going to do a lot of good. All right, I think I breezed through that. So that's all I have. Thank you very much. Yes.
Or is that just like where they leave 7 days later and it's like, okay, those 7 days become this, not like adding on or getting like later and later?
Yes, it is. So if you start late, it sort of compounds itself and you become later and later until you hit Chiloé. And then you get that high quality habitat sort of hits this reset button.
So it's not like the 7 plus the 12 was like.
Oh, no. It's 7 plus, well, okay, so if you start out at 5, then Saskatchewan adds 2 and it becomes 7. And sorry. But we have actually, I have tracked one individual bird that arrived to Chiloé 62 days late. And it's still left on time. So, you know, that I think is the real power there. Potentially having something that's really high quality habitat. Yeah.
Would you say that climate change is affecting that area? So would that then in the future impact their ability to?
Certainly, if we were to tweak Chiloé, bad things are going to happen. And there are things afoot. Chiloé it's an island, and they're talking about building a bridge out there that would facilitate deforestation, which is going to change hydrological patterns, and yeah, we can go down that road. But at the moment, we'll keep that as it's a good place. Yeah.
Are there any indications that they might move earlier to get to the terrestrial site prior to the incident?
Yeah, so that is very much where my research program is going right now. And the traditional thought is that birds that cross the equator, that they need to use what are called photoperiodic cues, like the change in day length that sort of says, oh, it's going to be springtime. And that's because photoperiod isn't changing with climate change, thank goodness, that they're then sort of lacking those cues about what's happening further north. But what we're finding with this Beluga route, where it seems like they are sort of able to have this cue, leads us to believe that maybe in other places they are sort of making those shifts. So yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to look into. I'll get you an answer in, I don't know, maybe a couple of years, I hope.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks to our 6 speakers. Don't forget, keep learning, keep communicating, get involved. So, and come get your seafood card and a sticker. Thank you, Eric. Yeah. Yeah.